Dave is a friend, and I was very pleased for the privilege of being able to share with Missouri Baptists what I would have normally shared with my class, because I really believe that the Bible's message shouldn't be changed from the classroom to any other venue that we show up in. But it's a very relevant one for Missouri Baptists today. Dave, I appreciate the opportunity to address the issue of a biblical mandate for civic involvement with a question mark after it. What does the Bible really have to say? Are we supposed to be involved in these things as Christians? And if so, in what way? Well, as you can see there, I was given the opportunity to share on 2 Chronicles 7:11 through 22. That's not the whole of what the Bible has to say about civic involvement, but it does address the issue. And so let's try to get into it a little bit if we can here. Which way do I need to point this? Maybe I need to make sure it's on. Oh, I did it. Okay, cool. I'm going to start with some background information. 2 Chronicles was written probably after the exilic period. It was written, in other words, maybe in the 400s or so. Israel had a long history before that, and God had an even longer history of involvement with humanity. In fact, He made us. And He, from the very beginning, had a word to human beings about how they are to conduct themselves in society. The Bible gives us the key elements of what God had to say, and we'll look at some of these together. But it is true that within the history of the nation of Israel, politics and religion were inseparably linked together. It was God who created the nation. In fact, let's see what all we've got in here. God was vitally involved not just in the creation of the nation, but in the leadership. He recognized that leadership had an extra responsibility as pace setters, as ones who could direct the nation's resources, as ones who could set the values, and through their example and through their edicts that they would issue within the land. God Himself was vitally involved in Israel's political process. And it is true that politicians were understood in the Bible. The biblical model is that God was the great shepherd of all humanity, but particularly of His covenant people. Kings were under-shepherds. They were workers for God. They got their ultimate paycheck from Him, not from any other source. And so they were expected to use their position and the nation's resources for God's agenda. There was no separation of church and state in that day. And let's see what we've got here. So that God expected Israel to maintain a society that conformed to His will, and it was the leaders who had the power to direct that. But it was not only the leader's job to take care of it. Every citizen, every person living in the land of Israel was expected to play a role as well. And let's see what we've got here. All right. And God was vitally involved in Israel's political process. It was He, in fact, for example, in the stories of 1 and 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, that God was personally involved in the selection of Israel's first 3 kings. Remember that it wasn't God's desire necessarily to have kingship. He did make provision. He did have a concession for that in the Torah, in the first 5 books of the Bible. The book of Deuteronomy in particular says that God recognized that someday Israel would say, we want a king like the other nations have. God said, well, I know that. Okay, when you do, here's some limits for what I want you to select for an individual. When the time came, when Israel said, we want a king like other nations have, God said, well, I knew this was coming. So let me have a role in this. And in fact, God did personally select Israel's first 3 kings. Saul was chosen by God, but his anointing was carried out by the prophet Samuel. Same was true with David. And we assume that God worked through Nathan the prophet, and beyond that, to make known to David that of his many sons, Solomon was to be the next king. And in fact, that is the way it worked out. But it was God who had selected these for Himself. And once God had chosen these leaders, He also empowered them. They used to symbolize this in the Old Testament by the pouring of a sacred oil on the head of the leaders within the land. That oil was a symbol of the presence of God, even as that shapeless liquid would invade the scalp of the leader, whether it be a high priest or a king, so the power and presence of God would invade that individual. They'd still be a human being. They would never become God. Some societies believe that their politicians were in fact gods, but that's not the way Israel had it. But they were to be human beings empowered by God, subordinate to God, servants of God. And God was the one who supplied the leadership, the guidance, and the resources needed, so that God would guide the politicians' decisions. And typically he would do this, I think, to keep the politicians humble, but he would do it usually through other spokespersons. Again, in many other societies outside of ancient Israel, whatever the king said went, because the king was, if not divine, certainly the most powerful person in their universe, within their land. And so it was that king, it was that individual who could say anything he wanted had to be done. But the Israelite model was different. The king was, in fact, at the top of the triangle, the apex of the triangle of power. But above him was God, and between him and God was the prophet, the one who would receive messages from God that were to be given to the king, so that the king was not ultimately the guy who could come up with policies. He was merely instituting policies that had been delivered to him by another mere human being who had himself gotten it from God. So that the model in ancient Israel was different from many other cultures throughout the ancient Near East. And God would guide the politicians' decisions, usually through spokesmen. Now, a lot of kings would try to get around this. They would put prophets on their staff. They would pay them, so that whenever they needed a word from a prophet, they would give that prophet a little profit, a little money, and out would come exactly the word the king wanted. The Bible speaks of these as false prophets, all right? That's not the biblical model that we are to follow, or that ancient Israel is to follow. The real prophets were ones who were accountable only to God. They didn't work for a paycheck. They worked for the pleasure of the satisfaction of doing what God had asked them to do. Many times they were criticized for it. Sometimes they paid the ultimate price for it. But nevertheless, their role was to inform the politicians of God's will and to leave the results to God. Now, usually the politicians used the nation's resources, and they were expected to, for religious purposes. See if we can have some of these come up here. For example, human resources. Solomon, for example, since we're talking about the early kings, built the temple using national human resources. The Bible speaks of some 30,000 woodcutters. That was before the days of Husqvarna and other kinds of wood-cutting implements. And every tree had to be cut down by hand. They were cut down from the mountains of the north, from Lebanon, the cedars of Lebanon. They were hauled from high elevations down to the sea, dragged there, rolled there, whatever, and then floated down the Mediterranean Sea, brought inland up to the area of Jerusalem after they had been hand-prepared as lumber fit for the building the temple. A lot of work involved in that. That was before the days of carbon pollution, but it was a different sort back then. But it wasn't two-cycle engine smoke and that kind of thing. But it was a labor-intensive sort of task. And in addition to build the temple, some 153,600 individuals, at least, were involved in the construction of the temple, in producing everything else and moving everything else that had to be moved and produced and set into place. Monstrous undertaking.